The wind did not whisper on the high plains. It howled, a raw, relentless voice that promised only solitude and unforgiving distance. Sarah pulled her thin shawl tighter. Its inadequate wool no match for the chill that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath her worn boots. Behind her, huddled against her legs, were her sons Elias, Caleb, and Isaac, their faces pinched with cold and exhaustion, eyes wide and frightened like startled fawns. Triplet boys, 7 years old, too young to fully grasp the precipice they stood upon, yet old enough to mirror her own gnawing fear. They had traveled for days, the last leg by wagon from the distant railhead, directed by taciturn men who saw only a burden in a widow and her brood. Their destination: the sprawling, isolated ranch of Thomas Blackwood, a man known more by rumor than by fact, wealthy, solitary, in need of a cook. Hope was a fragile thing, battered by grief and hardship. Her husband, taken by fever 2 years prior, had left her with little but debt and 3 hungry mouths. The small farm had failed. Relatives offered pity but no practical help. This advertisement, tacked to a general store post in a town miles away, had felt like a desperate, final lifeline. Cook wanted. Remote ranch. Generous pay. Apply in person. It hadn't mentioned the owner's temperament, the sheer desolation of the land, or the silent expectation that a cook might arrive alone. She hadn't dared write, fearing a letter would elicit a refusal. She had risked everything on appearing, presenting herself as an undeniable fact. Now, standing before the large, unyielding house that seemed to absorb the harsh light of the setting sun, her resolve faltered. The house was solid, built of thick timbers and stone, a fortress against the elements, but it offered no warmth from this distance. A single tendril of smoke curled from a chimney, the only sign of life. Footsteps crunched on the frozen earth. A man emerged from the barn, tall and broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the pale sky. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face, a heavy coat, and moved with the unhurried competence of someone entirely at home in this severe landscape. He stopped several yards away, assessing them with unnerving stillness. Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. The boys pressed closer, small, vulnerable bulwarks against her legs. "Mr. Blackwood?" she managed, her voice thin on the wind. He nodded slowly, a single, economical movement. He didn't offer a greeting or a welcome. He simply waited. I saw your advertisement," she continued, her voice gaining a fraction of strength as she forced herself to meet his shadowed gaze. "For a cook. My name is Sarah Jennings." She gestured faintly towards her sons. "And these are my boys, Elias, Caleb, and Isaac." Thomas Blackwood was silent for a long moment. The wind sang its desolate song around them. Sarah felt the ground shift under her feet, the fragile foundation of her hope crumbling. His stillness was not neutral. It was the stillness of surprise, perhaps displeasure. She could almost hear the unspoken question. "You came? With children?" The advertisement said, "Cook," he finally said, his voice deep and resonant, like stones shifting underground. It was not overtly hostile, but it held no welcome, only a statement of fact that seemed to emphasize the disparity between the request and her arrival. "I am a cook," Sarah affirmed, straightening her shoulders fractionally. "A good one. I can cook for your ranch hands, keep a clean kitchen, manage a larder. I am capable." She didn't mention that her only experience was cooking for her own family, making something from nothing, stretching thin resources until they snapped. The lie felt necessary, a shield. The truth of her desperation, of the empty pockets and colder nights behind them, was too raw to expose. "My boys. They are quiet. They can help. They don't eat much." The last was a desperate, humiliating offering. Blackwood looked at the boys, his gaze lingering. They stared back, wide-eyed, clutching Sarah's skirts. He didn't speak, his face unreadable in the deepening twilight. The air grew colder. Sarah felt a prickle of fear, sharp and intense. What if he simply turned them away? Send them back into the indifferent emptiness with no food, no shelter, nowhere to go? The vastness of the plains suddenly felt less like a challenge and more like a tomb. She held her breath, the fate of her small family hanging precariously in the balance. The wind howled louder, a mournful, lonely sound. He finally shifted, his weight settling slightly. He looked back at the house, then at the barn, a long, considering look. Sarah braced herself for the rejection, the quiet, final word that would extinguish the last spark of hope. But when he looked back at her, there was something new in his expression, something that wasn't quite acceptance, but wasn't outright refusal either. It was perhaps calculation or resignation. "The kitchen's cold," he said eventually, turning and walking towards the house. It wasn't an invitation, but he hadn't told them to leave. Sarah let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Come on, boys," she whispered, urging them forward. They followed him, small shadows trailing in the wake of his large form, towards the uncertain warmth of the house and whatever future awaited them within its unyielding walls. The scent of wood smoke, faint but real, offered the first tangible promise of shelter, a fragile anchor in the sea of their uncertainty. The kitchen was indeed cold, vast and cavernous, filled with the ghosts of meals long past. A large, black iron stove stood at its heart, a silent, imposing deity. Thomas Blackwood merely pointed towards a small, adjoining room. "You and the boys can sleep there. It's got a stove, needs firing." He gestured towards sacks piled near the back door. "Wood, coal. Water is drawn from the well by the barn." He spoke with the efficiency of a man used to giving orders, his gaze direct but not unkind. He didn't hover, didn't make small talk. He simply provided the necessary information, then turned and left, disappearing down a long hallway without another word. Sarah stared after him, a bewildering mix of relief and trepidation flooding her. She had a place to sleep, fuel for heat, and implicitly the job was hers, at least for now. But the isolation, the sheer silence of the house once his footsteps faded, pressed in. The boys, sensing the shift from outside cold to indoor chill, began to shiver more noticeably. "Elias, Caleb, Isaac," she said, her voice low but firm. "Help me. We need to make a fire." Their small hands, clumsy but eager, fumbled with kindling under her direction. The smell of coal dust filled the air. It took several attempts, but finally, a reluctant flame caught, licking at the wood, then the coal. A hesitant warmth began to spread through the small room. Sarah watched it, mesmerized, as if it held the promise of not just physical warmth, but a warmth of spirit, a shielding against the encroaching despair. She spread their few blankets on the floor near the stove, a makeshift bed. The boys curled up together, their small bodies intertwined, finding comfort in proximity. While they rested, Sarah explored the kitchen. The larder was well stocked, a surprise and a relief. Flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salted meat, canned goods. More than she had seen in months. A root cellar held potatoes, onions, and other hearty vegetables. She found a large pot, filled it with water from a pail left near the back door, and set it on the cold stove. Thomas had said nothing about food, but the presence of supplies implied she was to use them. She found coffee beans, ground them by hand, and set a pot brewing. The rich aroma filled the cold air, a small luxury. When Thomas returned, the kitchen was still dim, lit only by the low light from the sleeping room stove and a single lamp Sarah had found. The coffee was ready. She poured a mug and offered it to him without speaking. He took it, his large hands dwarfing the cup, and stood by the stove, letting the heat seep into him. The silence between them was heavy, but different from the silence outside. It felt less empty, more like a shared space of necessary quiet. "Thank you," he said eventually, the words quiet. "You're welcome," she replied, her own voice equally soft. He drank his coffee slowly, watching her as she moved about the kitchen, organizing, finding utensils, familiarizing herself with the space. He didn't pry, didn't ask about her past or her husband. He simply observed. Sarah, in turn, observed him. His face, now visible in the lamplight, was weathered, lined by sun and wind, his eyes a pale, sharp blue. He looked like a man who had seen much and said little, who found his comfort in the predictable rhythms of the land and his livestock, not in human company. Later that evening, she made a simple stew with some dried meat and potatoes from the cellar. It wasn't much, but it was warm and filling. She served him a bowl, then the boys, who ate with the quiet intensity of the chronically hungry. Sarah ate little, her stomach still knotted with anxiety, but she felt a flicker of satisfaction seeing her sons eat their fill. Thomas ate steadily, his gaze thoughtful. "The hands eat before dawn," he said when he finished, pushing the bowl away. "And again at noon. Supper at dusk." "I understand," she replied. The schedule was clear. The expectations, while unspoken, were beginning to form. Provide food, maintain the kitchen, stay out of the way. "They'll be surprised," he added almost to himself, "seeing you. And the boys." Sarah felt a fresh wave of apprehension. The ranch hands. More men to face, more potential judgment. "We will keep to ourselves," she promised, though the thought of confining 3 energetic boys to this isolated house filled her with dread. He nodded, a brief inclination of his head. "Get some rest, Mrs. Jennings." "Sarah," she corrected gently. "My name is Sarah." He paused, considering the unfamiliar sound of a first name spoken in this house. "Sarah," he repeated, the name sounding extranjeros on his tongue. He left soon after, the silence settling back in, but somehow it felt less oppressive than before. The stove in the little room glowed red, casting a warm light. Her boys slept soundly, bellies full, safe from the wind's bite. It was not a home, not yet, perhaps never would be, but for tonight it was shelter. And in this land of stark necessities, shelter was everything. She lay down beside her sons, listening to the distant howl of the wind, and for the first time in a long time, did not feel utterly exposed. She felt the weight of her sons' sleeping bodies beside her, the quiet strength of their shared presence. This, she thought, was her anchor. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the needs of the ranch and the unforgiving arc of the sun. Sarah rose before dawn, her body aching but driven by purpose. The kitchen came alive under her hands. She learned the preferences of the taciturn ranch hands, how they liked their coffee, the kind of sourdough they favored. They were rough men, weathered and quiet like blackwood, surprised but mostly indifferent to her presence and that of the boys. They ate the food she prepared, offered curt nods or simple thank yous, and returned to their work. The boys, after their initial shyness, adapted with surprising speed. The ranch, vast and dangerous as it was, became their playground. Under Sarah's watchful eye, they explored the immediate vicinity of the house and barn, collecting rocks, chasing grasshoppers, their small voices a startling counterpoint to the deep silence of the plains. Thomas had set boundaries. The creek was off-limits unless she was with them. They were to stay clear of the corrals and the main herd. He didn't soften his demeanor for them, but Sarah noticed small things. He repaired a broken fence near the house where they played. He didn't scold them when their ball rolled near his feet. Once, he paused to watch them tumble in the dust, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Sarah found her own rhythm. The physical labor of cooking, cleaning, and managing the household was demanding, but the structure was grounding. She poured her energy into it, finding a quiet satisfaction in competence. She mended her son's clothes, washed laundry by hand, kept the small sleeping room tidy. She proved her worth not with words, but with action, with the steady output of good food and a clean, orderly kitchen that became the warm heart of the Stark house. Her interactions with Thomas remained sparse, built on necessity and mutual observation. He would come into the kitchen for coffee or to discuss supplies, but rarely lingered. Yet, in the quiet moments, Sarah felt the weight of his gaze. He watched her while she kneaded dough, while she stirred a pot, while she comforted a tearful child. It wasn't intrusive, more like a quiet assessment, a slow, deliberate taking of her measure. And she watched him, too. Saw the calluses on his hands, the weariness sometimes etched around his eyes after a long day. Saw the quiet competence in everything he did. One evening, after the hands had eaten and retired, and the boys were asleep, Sarah was sitting by the dying embers of the kitchen stove, mending a sock. Thomas came in, drawn perhaps by the faint light. He poured himself coffee and sat at the large table, not facing her directly, but close enough that the silence was shared rather than isolating. "The winter will be hard," he said, his voice low. It wasn't a complaint, simply a statement of fact. "I know," she replied, not looking up from her sewing. She had seen the signs, the thick coats on the livestock, the sharpness of the evening air. "You and the boys. You'll need warmer things." Sarah's needle stilled. Her few possessions were inadequate for the coming cold. She had no money for new clothes. "We'll manage," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Thomas was silent again for a long moment. "I'll send for supplies next time the wagon goes to town. Make a list." Relief washed over her, potent and unexpected. It wasn't charity. It felt like a practical necessity, acknowledged and addressed. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." "Thomas." She looked up, surprised. "Thomas," she repeated, the name easier this time. He gave a short nod. "Sarah." He finished his coffee and rose. "Snow's coming. Feels like it." He left, leaving Sarah with the quiet click of her needle and a feeling she hadn't expected to find here. A tentative sense of being seen, of belonging, however small, in this remote place. The harshness of the land hadn't softened, but the edges of her own isolation felt less sharp. She still carried the weight of her past, the ache of loss, but it was balanced now by the immediate, tangible reality of her present. The warmth of the stove, the presence of her sleeping sons, the quiet promise of supplies for the winter, and the unexpected, silent partnership with the man who owned this land, this house, this fragile haven. The snow came, thick and silent, blanketing the world in white. The ranch became even more isolated, a small island in a sea of drifts. Life retreated indoors, or huddled close to the barn and corrals. The boys were confined to the house, their energy boundless despite the limited space. Sarah devised games, read the few books she possessed over and over, and taught them to help with small chores, sweeping, carrying wood. They watched the storms through frosted windows, the vast, white world outside both beautiful and menacing. The forced proximity inside the house changed the dynamic between Sarah and Thomas. He spent more time indoors, the cattle needing less attention in the deep snow. They shared meals at the large kitchen table, the boys' chatter filling the space that had once been so quiet. Thomas didn't engage in their games, but he listened, sometimes offering a quiet comment on a bird they'd spotted or a cloud formation. He brought her books from a dusty shelf in the parlor, histories, novels, poetry, a silent acknowledgement of her world beyond cooking and cleaning. She saw layers in him she hadn't initially perceived. Beneath the stoic exterior was a sharp mind, a deep knowledge of the land and its ways. He spoke little of himself, but she learned about his life through oblique references, years spent building the ranch, the constant battle against nature and market forces. He was a man shaped by solitude and hard work, his silence a habit, not a wall. One evening, a fierce blizzard raged outside, rattling the window panes. The wind shrieked like a banshee. Sarah had made a large pot of stew, the warmth and aroma a defiance of the storm. They ate together, Sarah, Thomas, and the boys. Afterwards, the boys were drawing by the stove, their tongues poking out in concentration. Sarah was cleaning the table, and Thomas sat by the fire watching the flames. "It's a hard life," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind's roar. Sarah paused, her cloth stilled. "It is. Harder for a woman alone." "Yes," she agreed softly. Her past flashed before her, the struggle, the fear, the gnawing uncertainty. "But you learn to be strong. You have to." He looked at her then, his blue eyes steady. "You are strong, Sarah." The simple statement, delivered without flourish or expectation, went straight to her core. It was a recognition of her effort, her resilience, in a world that had offered little but resistance. Her throat tightened. "Thank you, Thomas." The moment hung between them, fragile and significant. It was not a declaration of affection, but something perhaps deeper, a mutual respect, an acknowledgement of shared endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. It was the quiet foundation upon which something real could potentially be built. Later that night, a different sound penetrated the howl of the storm, the distant, panicked bawling of cattle. Thomas was instantly alert, his face grim. "Rustlers," he said, the word a low growl. Sarah's blood ran cold. Rustlers were a threat in this country, ruthless and violent. "In this storm, they figure nobody's out," he said, already pulling on his heavy coat. "Especially not alone." "You can't go alone," Sarah said immediately, fear warring with a fierce protectiveness of this fragile haven they had found. The ranch hands were in their own bunkhouse, a distance away, and in this weather, rousing them might take too long. "I have to," he replied, his hand going to the rifle mounted above the fireplace. No, Sarah's mind raced. She thought of her sons sleeping soundly in the next room, oblivious. This place, this man, represented their safety, their future. She couldn't lose it, not now. She knew the ranch house layout, the surrounding land, the habits of the men who sought to steal. "I can help." Thomas paused, rifle in hand, his gaze sharp. "How?" "I know the layout. I can watch the back, signal if I see anything. I can load your rifles if you need it. I can stay here and keep the boys safe, yes, but I won't just hide. Not when it's our home too." Her voice was firm, no trace of her usual quiet deference. The vulnerability she had arrived with was gone, replaced by a fierce, maternal resolve. This wasn't just his fight. It was theirs. He studied her face for a long moment, seeing the determination etched there. He saw not a helpless widow, but a woman forged by hardship, ready to defend what was hers. The wind screamed outside, a chaotic symphony of ice and fury. The cattle cries continued, a desperate sound. Time was running out. "All right," he said, a hint of surprise in his tone. "Get the Spencer from the study. Load it. Stay away from the windows. If you see anything, anything at all, yell. Loud." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. She moved quickly, her fear channeled into action. While Thomas pulled on his boots and checked his rifle, she retrieved the Spencer repeating rifle, heavy and cool in her hands. She found the cartridges he indicated and, with trembling but steady fingers, loaded the magazine. The weight of the weapon, the metallic click of the action, felt alien and terrifying, yet also empowering. She wasn't helpless. Not anymore. The storm howled, the cattle cried, and the threat was real, immediate. But she stood ready, a protector of her small, hard-won world. The hours that followed were a blur of tension and biting cold. Sarah stayed low, peering through cracks in the window coverings, listening intently over the storm's roar and the distant, panicked sounds from the herd. Thomas had gone out into the maelstrom, a single figure swallowed by the white fury. She heard faint shouts carried on the wind, the crack of a rifle shot. Thomas's? Or one of the rustlers? Her heart leaped into her throat. She gripped the Spencer, her knuckles white. The boys slept on, miraculously undisturbed by the chaos. Sarah kept checking on them, their peaceful breathing a stark contrast to the violence brewing outside. Their vulnerability spurred her on, hardening her resolve. She would defend this house, this fragile stability, with everything she had. Suddenly, a shape moved near the barn, indistinct in the swirling snow. Another. Rustlers trying to approach the house, perhaps expecting it to be empty or undefended after Blackwood went out. Panic flared, sharp and immediate, but then instinct took over. She remembered Thomas's instruction. Yell. Loud. She threw open the back door, the wind ripping it from her grasp, and screamed into the blizzard. "Get out. Get away from the house. We're armed." Her voice, raw with fear and fury, was amplified by the wind, carrying unexpectedly far. The figures froze. Then, seeing the open door, perhaps assuming more than one person was inside, they turned and vanished back into the white curtain. Sarah slammed the door shut, leaning against it, trembling. She hadn't fired a shot, but she had acted. She had protected her sons, the house. Hours later, as dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of bruised purple and gray, Thomas returned. He was covered in snow, his face gaunt with exhaustion and cold, but unharmed. He carried his rifle loosely. "They got some," he said, his voice raspy, stomping snow from his boots. "But not many. Drove them off. I scared some away from the barn," Sarah said hesitantly. "I yelled." He looked at her, really looked at her. A slow acknowledgement spread across his face. "You did good, Sarah." It was the highest praise she had received in years, maybe ever. The immediate threat had passed, but something fundamental had shifted. They had faced danger together, side by side, protecting what was theirs. The house, the ranch, no longer felt solely like Thomas Blackwood's domain where Sarah Jennings was merely an employee. It felt like a shared space, built on mutual reliance and quiet strength. The following days were filled with the aftermath, tracking lost cattle, repairing fences damaged by the storm and the rustlers. Life on the ranch resumed its harsh rhythm, but within the house, a different rhythm had begun. The silence between Sarah and Thomas was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken understanding, a comfortable companionship born of shared hardship and mutual respect. Thomas began to include her in decisions about supplies, about the household. He asked her opinion. The boys, once tentative visitors, were now as much a part of the ranch as the livestock. They followed Thomas sometimes, watching him work, asking him endless questions he answered with surprising patience. The vast, lonely plains still surrounded them. The wind still howled its ancient song of isolation. But inside the sturdy house, warmth bloomed. It wasn't the warmth of romantic love. Not yet, perhaps never. It was the warmth of partnership, of shared purpose, of finding family in the most unexpected of places. Sarah had come seeking refuge, a temporary haven for her sons. She had found not just shelter, but a sense of belonging she hadn't known she was missing. Thomas, the solitary rancher, had opened his home and found it filled not just with noise and activity, but with a quiet strength, a fierce love, and a resilience that mirrored his own. She stood at the window one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors. Thomas stood beside her, looking out at the land he had wrestled into submission. The boys were playing a quiet game by the fire. The scent of baking bread filled the kitchen. It was a simple scene, ordinary in its domesticity, yet extraordinary in its existence here, in this remote corner of the world. Resilience, Sarah thought, was not about enduring alone. It was about finding strength in connection, in the quiet bond forged in shared storms and unexpected kindness. It was about building a home not just with walls and a roof, but with trust, respect, and the simple, profound fact of not being alone anymore. The future on the high plains would always be uncertain, demanding, perhaps even dangerous. But looking at her sons, at the quiet man beside her, Sarah knew they would face it together, and that, in this lonely, beautiful land, was everything. She had come seeking a cook's job. She had found a life.